Marine colonel said, "No pilot can fly through that flak wall." Then she saved 6 lives in the deadliest airspace of the Vietnam War. Captain Sophia Thompson gripped the cyclic of her UH-1 Huey helicopter, her knuckles white beneath leather flight gloves as she studied the hellscape that stretched before her. Khe Sanh Combat Base lay under siege, surrounded by North Vietnamese artillery positions that had been pounding the isolated Marine outpost for 77 days. Through her helmet visor, she could see the constant flash of incoming mortar rounds and the thick smoke columns rising from the embattled firebase. What the Marines at Da Nang Air Base didn't know was that Captain Sophia Thompson wasn't just any helicopter pilot. For 3 years, she had been flying under a carefully constructed military identity that concealed the fact that she was one of only 12 women secretly serving as combat pilots in Vietnam. Her personnel records listed her as Captain S. Thompson, and her slight build, short-cropped dark hair, and regulation flight suit allowed her to pass unnoticed among the hundreds of male aviators rotating through Southeast Asia. Sophia's background was as extraordinary as her flying ability. Born in Seattle to Dr. Robert Thompson, an aeronautical engineer who designed helicopter rotor systems for Boeing, and Professor Margaret Thompson, who taught advanced physics at the University of Washington, she had grown up understanding the complex mathematics that governed rotorcraft flight dynamics. Her childhood had been spent calculating lift coefficients, rotor disk loading, and auto-rotation procedures while other children played with dolls. The mission brief had been classified at the highest levels. Major Garcia, a military intelligence officer attached to the besieged Marines at Khe Sanh, had obtained critical information about a planned North Vietnamese offensive that could change the entire strategic balance of the Tet campaign. Garcia possessed detailed troop movement schedules, artillery positions, and supply route intelligence that could save thousands of American lives if delivered to MACV headquarters in Saigon. Garcia was trapped. The siege of Khe Sanh had cut off all ground evacuation routes, and the North Vietnamese had positioned surface-to-air missile batteries and anti-aircraft guns in overlapping fields of fire that made helicopter extraction virtually impossible. 2 previous rescue attempts had resulted in the loss of 4 aircraft and 8 crew members. Marine pilots called the airspace around Khe Sanh the graveyard because more helicopters had been shot down there than any other location in Southeast Asia. Welcome to the Story Chronicles, where courage writes history and heroes emerge from the impossible. Colonel Blake Williams, commander of Marine Air Group 16, had personally briefed Sophia on the mission parameters in the pre-dawn darkness of Da Nang's operations bunker. Williams was a 20-year Marine veteran who had flown combat missions in Korea and commanded helicopter squadrons through 2 tours in Vietnam. He had never lost more aircraft or crew members than during the ongoing siege of Khe Sanh. The stress of watching young pilots disappear into the deadly airspace around the combat base had aged him visibly during the 77-day siege. "Thompson, I'm going to be straight with you," Colonel Blake Williams said, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the briefing table. "This is a suicide mission disguised as a rescue operation. Intelligence estimates there are over 40,000 North Vietnamese troops surrounding Khe Sanh, and they've got the entire valley covered with interlocking fields of anti-aircraft fire." Sophia studied the aerial photographs with the analytical mind that had made her one of the most effective helicopter pilots in the theater. The images showed SA-2 missile sites, 57mm anti-aircraft gun positions, heavy machine gun nests, and rocket-propelled grenade teams positioned on every ridge and hillside surrounding the combat base. Any helicopter approaching Khe Sanh would have to fly through a gauntlet of overlapping defensive fire that military tacticians had labeled the most lethal airspace in Southeast Asia. The tactical situation was unprecedented in helicopter warfare. Intelligence reports indicated that the North Vietnamese had studied American helicopter tactics for months, positioning their anti-aircraft defenses to create kill zones at every altitude and approach vector. Low-level flight paths exposed aircraft to small arms fire, RPGs, and heavy machine guns. Medium-altitude approaches brought helicopters into the engagement envelope of 57mm and 37mm anti-aircraft guns. High-altitude flight patterns made aircraft vulnerable to SA-2 surface-to-air missiles guided by sophisticated radar systems. "What's the extraction window?" Sophia asked, her voice steady despite the obvious suicide nature of the assignment. "Garcia will be at landing zone Bravo at 0800 hours. That gives you exactly 15 minutes to get in, pick him up, and get out before the morning artillery barrage begins. After 0815, the entire LZ will be under constant bombardment from 130mm guns positioned in caves along the ridgelines." Colonel Williams pointed to a small clearing barely 200 meters from the main perimeter. "LZ Bravo is right in the middle of their target zone. You'll be landing under direct enemy observation, and they'll have every gun in the valley trained on your aircraft the moment you appear over the ridgeline." Sophia had flown over 300 combat missions in Vietnam, but she had never attempted an extraction from a landing zone that was actively under siege and surrounded by enemy forces. The tactical challenges were unprecedented. The approach corridor to LZ Bravo required flying through a narrow valley flanked by enemy positions on both sides. There was no concealment, no alternative routes, and no backup landing zones if the primary site was compromised. "Colonel, what aircraft am I cleared to take?" "Huey 476. She's been modified with additional armor plating and defensive systems. But Thompson, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the aircraft or the tactical situation. This is about whether you're willing to die to get Major Garcia out of there." Williams pulled out classified damage assessment reports from the 2 previous rescue attempts. Both helicopters had been hit by concentrated anti-aircraft fire before reaching the landing zone. The first aircraft had taken 47 bullet holes and crash-landed with total hydraulic failure. The second helicopter had been struck by an RPG that killed 2 crew members and forced an emergency landing 800 meters short of the target. Sophia looked at the mission photographs one more time, calculating flight paths, timing sequences, and defensive maneuvers with the precision that had kept her alive through 3 years of combat flying. "Colonel, Major Garcia has intelligence that could save American lives?" "Thousands of them. Garcia intercepted North Vietnamese communication traffic that details planned attacks against Da Nang, Chu Lai, and Phu Bai. Without that intelligence, we're looking at coordinated assaults that could overrun 3 major American installations." "Then I'll get him out." At 0630 hours, Sophia began her pre-flight inspection of UH-1 serial number 66-16476, a battle-scarred Huey that had survived 18 months of combat operations in Vietnam. The helicopter had been fitted with additional armor plating around the cockpit and cabin, M60 machine guns mounted on both sides, and electronic countermeasures designed to confuse enemy radar systems. Extra fuel tanks had been installed to extend range, and the aircraft carried emergency medical supplies in case Garcia was wounded during extraction. The modifications had been developed through hard experience. Every system on the helicopter reflected lessons learned from previous combat losses. Armor placement protected critical flight controls from small arms fire. Redundant hydraulic systems provided backup capability if primary systems were damaged. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire hazard from tracer rounds. Emergency flotation gear allowed water landings if the aircraft was forced down over rivers or coastal areas. Lieutenant Jackson Morris, her co-pilot and crew chief, completed the weapons check and communication systems test. Morris was a 22-year-old warrant officer from Tennessee who had flown 127 combat missions alongside Sophia. He was one of the few people in Vietnam who knew that Captain S. Thompson was actually a woman, and he had kept that secret with the loyalty that developed between aircrew members who depended on each other for survival. Morris had initially been skeptical about flying with a female pilot, but Sophia's skill and courage had earned his complete respect and trust. She had saved his life twice during previous missions, once by executing an emergency landing after taking heavy battle damage, and once by flying through intense ground fire to extract his downed crew from a hot landing zone near the DMZ. Sophia, you know this is insane, right? Morris said quietly as they completed the final pre-flight checklist. Intelligence is calling this the most heavily defended target in Southeast Asia. We're going to be flying into a shooting gallery where every enemy gun in the valley will be aimed at us. Sophia adjusted her flight helmet and checked her survival gear one final time. Body armor, emergency radio, medical kit, sidearm, and survival rations that might keep her alive if she was shot down behind enemy lines. Her survival vest also carried blood chits printed in Vietnamese, offering rewards for safe return to American forces, and a small signaling mirror that could be used to attract search and rescue aircraft. Jackson, Major Garcia has intelligence about a planned offensive that could hit our bases throughout the region. If we don't get him out, a lot of American soldiers are going to die. At 07:15 hours, Huey 476 lifted off from Da Nang Air Base and began the 45-minute flight northwest toward the besieged combat base at Khe Sanh. The route took them over mountainous terrain controlled by North Vietnamese forces, requiring constant altitude changes and evasive maneuvers to avoid known anti-aircraft positions. Sophia flew using terrain masking techniques, staying below ridgelines and using natural features to conceal their approach. The flight path had been planned to avoid known enemy strongholds, but intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese forces were constantly moving anti-aircraft weapons to new positions. Every hill, valley, and river crossing represented a potential ambush site where enemy gunners could engage passing aircraft with devastating effect. As they approached the Khe Sanh Valley, Sophia could see the massive North Vietnamese siege works that surrounded the isolated Marine base. Artillery positions, troop concentrations, and supply routes stretched for miles in every direction. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft defenses with the systematic precision of a military engineering project designed to make helicopter operations impossible. Smoke columns rose from dozens of positions where Marine counter-battery fire was engaging enemy artillery. The constant rumble of explosions echoed through the mountains as both sides exchanged bombardments that had continued without pause for 77 days. The siege of Khe Sanh had become the longest sustained artillery duel in the history of the Vietnam War. "Contact! Contact! Contact!" Morris called out, his voice sharp with tension. "Multiple SAM sites painting us with radar. They know we're here." Through her cockpit windscreen, Sophia could see the distinctive smoke trails of surface-to-air missiles launching from positions around the valley. The SA-2 missiles climbed toward their helicopter with deadly precision, forcing her into violent evasive maneuvers that stressed the aircraft to its mechanical limits. The missiles were radar-guided weapons designed to engage high-altitude targets, but they could be lethal to helicopters if fired in sufficient numbers. "Chaff, chaff, chaff," she called out, deploying metallic strips designed to confuse enemy radar systems while diving toward the valley floor in a desperate attempt to break the missile lock. The first SAM passed within 100 meters of their rotor blades, close enough that the explosion's shockwave rocked the helicopter and filled the cockpit with acrid smoke. Anti-aircraft guns throughout the valley opened fire simultaneously, creating a wall of tracer rounds and explosive shells that turned the sky into a lethal light show. Sophia flew with the instinctive reactions that separated exceptional pilots from dead ones. She used terrain features to mask their approach, flying between ridgelines and using natural cover to avoid the heaviest concentrations of enemy fire. Her flight path was unpredictable, constantly changing altitude, direction, and speed to prevent enemy gunners from establishing a firing solution. The helicopter's defensive systems were working at maximum capacity. Electronic countermeasures jammed enemy radar frequencies, while chaff dispensers deployed metallic clouds to confuse missile guidance systems. The armor plating absorbed multiple hits from small arms fire, protecting critical flight controls and crew areas from battle damage. "LZ Bravo in sight," Morris reported. "I can see Garcia's signal panel." The landing zone was a small clearing surrounded by shell craters and debris from weeks of bombardment. Major Garcia was crouched behind a damaged bunker, waiting for extraction, while enemy mortars continued to impact throughout the area. Sophia could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving through the tree line, positioning themselves to engage her helicopter the moment she landed. The tactical situation at the landing zone was deteriorating rapidly. Intelligence reports had indicated light enemy activity, but Sophia could see at least 30 North Vietnamese soldiers in defensive positions around the clearing. They had been waiting for the rescue helicopter, turning the extraction into a carefully planned ambush. This is Angel Flight requesting immediate fire support on LZ Bravo. We need suppressive fire on the eastern tree line to cover our extraction. Marine artillery batteries at Khe Sanh responded with a concentrated barrage that temporarily suppressed enemy positions around the landing zone. 105mm howitzers and 155mm guns delivered high explosive rounds with precision that reflected months of defensive combat experience. The artillery fire created a protective screen that allowed Sophia to begin her approach without taking immediate ground fire. Sophia used the brief lull in incoming fire to begin her approach, flying fast and low while Morris prepared the cabin for emergency evacuation procedures. The approach required split-second timing to coordinate with the artillery barrage and minimize exposure to enemy weapons. Join the story chronicles, where impossible missions become legendary victories. The helicopter touched down in the landing zone for exactly 23 seconds. Major Garcia sprinted from his covered position and dove through the cabin door, while enemy small arms fire began impacting around the aircraft. Sophia applied maximum power and lifted off immediately, climbing steeply to clear the surrounding ridgelines while tracer rounds streaked past the rotor blades. "We've got him," Morris reported. "Garcia's aboard and we're climbing out." But their escape route was blocked. North Vietnamese forces had positioned additional anti-aircraft guns along their planned exit corridor during the brief time they had been on the ground. The enemy had anticipated their escape route and prepared a deadly crossfire that made retreat impossible through the original flight path. Sophia found herself trapped in the valley with enemy guns firing from every direction. SA-2 missiles were launching from 3 different positions. 57mm anti-aircraft guns were tracking their movement, and heavy machine guns were filling the air with tracer rounds. The helicopter was taking hits from multiple directions simultaneously. Angel Flight, this is Khe Sanh Base. You're taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Recommend immediate extraction via alternate route Charlie. Route Charlie required flying directly over the main North Vietnamese siege positions, an approach that would expose them to the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire in the valley. But it was their only option for escape. The alternative routes had been blocked by enemy forces who had positioned themselves to prevent helicopter extraction. Sophia made a decision that violated every tactical manual and common sense principle about helicopter survival in hostile airspace. Instead of attempting to avoid the enemy defenses, she decided to fly directly through them at maximum speed, using surprise and aggressive maneuvering to minimize their exposure time. "Hold on, everyone! We're going straight through their positions." The Huey accelerated to its maximum airspeed of 127 knots, flying barely 50 feet above the ground, while every anti-aircraft gun in the valley converged on their flight path. Sophia used every natural terrain feature, flying through narrow valleys, around hilltops, and between trees in a desperate attempt to avoid the concentrated enemy fire. Tracer rounds filled the air around them like deadly fireworks. The helicopter's armor plating absorbed multiple hits from small arms fire, and shrapnel from exploding anti-aircraft shells peppered the fuselage. Morris returned fire with the door-mounted M60 machine guns, engaging enemy positions while Sophia concentrated on flying through the most lethal airspace any helicopter pilot had ever survived. The noise inside the helicopter was overwhelming. The rotor blades were chopping through air filled with smoke and debris. Engine noise combined with the crack of passing bullets and the explosion of anti-aircraft rounds created a cacophony that made communication almost impossible. The aircraft shook violently from near misses and direct hits on non-critical systems. Taking hits, Morris reported. "We've got damage to the tail rotor and hydraulic system, but she's still flying." Major Garcia, crouched in the cabin with his intelligence documents secured in a waterproof case, watched through the door gunner's position as they flew through a continuous barrage of enemy fire. He was a 15-year Army intelligence veteran who had served in classified operations throughout Southeast Asia, but he had never experienced combat of this intensity. Garcia's intelligence documents contained detailed information about planned North Vietnamese attacks against American installations throughout South Vietnam. The information included troop movement schedules, artillery positions, supply routes, and timing data that would allow American forces to prepare defensive positions and coordinate counterattacks. The helicopter cleared the main enemy positions and began climbing toward the relative safety of higher altitude, but their mechanical problems were becoming critical. The tail rotor damage was affecting directional control, and hydraulic fluid was leaking from multiple systems throughout the aircraft. Warning lights illuminated throughout the cockpit as damaged systems began failing. Angel Flight, this is Da Nang Tower. We're tracking your position and have emergency crews standing by. What's your status? Da Nang Tower, Angel Flight. We have major mechanical damage, but we're still airborne. ETA your location 25 minutes with critical fuel state. Sophia flew the damaged helicopter with the skill that had made her one of the most effective combat pilots in Vietnam. She compensated for the tail rotor damage by adjusting her collective and cyclic inputs, maintaining directional control through careful manipulation of the aircraft's remaining flight systems. The helicopter required constant pilot input to maintain stable flight. The 25-minute flight back to Da Nang became a test of mechanical endurance and pilot skill. The helicopter vibrated severely from rotor imbalance, hydraulic systems continued to leak essential fluids, and electrical problems caused multiple warning lights to illuminate throughout the cockpit. Fuel consumption was higher than normal due to the damage, and they were approaching the minimum fuel required for safe landing. Sophia monitored engine parameters constantly, watching for signs of impending mechanical failure. Oil pressure remained stable, but engine temperatures were elevated due to battle damage. The transmission was operating normally, but unusual vibrations indicated possible damage to the rotor head or drive systems. But Sophia had saved 6 American lives. Major Garcia carried intelligence that would prevent a coordinated North Vietnamese offensive against 3 major American bases. The information he possessed would save thousands of American soldiers from surprise attacks that had been planned as follow-up operations to the siege of Khe Sanh. Huey 476 landed at Da Nang Air Base with barely 5 minutes of fuel remaining and mechanical systems that were on the verge of complete failure. Sophia shut down the engines and sat in the pilot's seat for a long moment, processing the fact that she had just flown through the most intense anti-aircraft fire any helicopter pilot had survived in Vietnam. Emergency crews surrounded the helicopter immediately, assessing battle damage and preparing the aircraft for extensive repair work. Maintenance personnel counted over 60 bullet holes, shrapnel damage throughout the fuselage, and critical systems failures that should have made flight impossible. Colonel Williams met them at the aircraft, personally helping Major Garcia transfer his intelligence documents to waiting military personnel. The information would be analyzed, distributed to combat units throughout South Vietnam, and used to prevent enemy attacks that could have changed the strategic balance of the entire conflict. Thompson, I need to know how you flew through that defensive fire. According to our intelligence estimates, no aircraft should have been able to survive that level of anti-aircraft concentration. Sophia removed her flight helmet and looked at the Marine colonel with the quiet confidence of someone who had just accomplished the impossible through skill, courage, and determination. Sir, sometimes you have to fly through hell to save lives. Major Garcia's intelligence was worth the risk. Williams studied the battle damage to Sophia's helicopter. Over 60 bullet holes, shrapnel damage throughout the fuselage, critical systems failures, and structural damage that would require months of repair work. That was the most incredible flying I've ever witnessed. You saved American lives today. The debriefing took 3 hours as intelligence officers documented every aspect of the mission. Sophia provided detailed information about enemy positions, anti-aircraft capabilities, and tactical procedures that would be used to plan future operations in the Khe Sanh area. 6 months later, military historians would identify Major Garcia's intelligence as the decisive factor that prevented the North Vietnamese from launching coordinated follow-up attacks during the Tet Offensive. The information he carried out of Khe Sanh allowed American commanders to reinforce threatened positions and position defensive forces that ultimately repelled enemy assaults throughout South Vietnam. Captain Sophia Thompson continued flying combat missions in Vietnam until her tour ended 8 months later. Her personnel file listed her as Captain S. Thompson, routine helicopter pilot with standard qualifications. But in the classified archives of Military Assistance Command Vietnam, her rescue mission was recorded as the most strategically significant helicopter operation of the entire conflict. Colonel Williams never forgot the pilot who flew through impossible defenses to save American lives. Years later, when the military began officially recognizing women's contributions to combat operations, he made sure that Sophia's achievements were properly documented and honored. Sophia returned to civilian life after Vietnam, but her military service had proven that courage, skill, and determination could overcome any obstacle. Her flight through the deadliest airspace of the Vietnam War had saved thousands of American lives and demonstrated that heroes come in all forms. The Marine colonel had said no pilot could fly through that flak wall. Captain Sophia Thompson had proven him wrong with 3 simple words that echoed through military history. Then I'll fly. Some people see impossible missions and turn away. Others see impossible missions and find a way through hell itself. Sophia Thompson didn't just save Major Garcia that day. She saved thousands of American soldiers who never knew her name, never saw her face, and never learned that their lives depended on one woman's refusal to accept the word impossible. Years later, military historians would debate whether the Khe Sanh rescue actually happened. The mission remained classified, the pilot's identity was sealed, and officially, no helicopter flew through that valley of death. But in the Brotherhood of Combat Aviators, they still tell stories about the pilot who flew through hell and came back alive. They don't know her name. They don't know her face. They just know that somewhere in Vietnam, impossibility became inevitable because someone decided that saving lives was worth any risk. Subscribe to the Story Chronicles because some heroes fly through hell and never ask for recognition.